Hey, so I'm happy to have Joel Edmund Anderson here with me today. So Joel is the proprietor of the Resurrecting Orthodoxy blog, and he is an author and a teacher and a Bible scholar and an all-around Enlightenment man. And we're happy
Very
to
good.
have him here. And he's also done a lot of writing on Answers in Genesis, and that's sort of the topic today. In fact, the topic is a sort of a cafeteria food fight, an intramural Christian spat between Answers in Genesis, which is the preeminent young earth creationist advocacy group, and BioLogos, which is the preeminent Christian group advocating acceptance of evolution. And what happened, in my view, is that Answers in Genesis blindsided BioLogos. They put out some articles calling them a house of heresy and false teachers, and saying that BioLogos should be avoided by Christians. And this was very severe. And the reasons they used are the standard reasons, that BioLogos rejects a global flood, they accept evolution, and they have various views on the historicity of Adam and Eve. And also, Answers in Genesis cherry-picked a few, three in particular, quotes from contributors to the BioLogos site that, out of context, sort of look not so great. And they say, hey, these guys are all false teachers, and it's the house of heresy, and you got to avoid them. Now, BioLogos has defended itself, but they've shown restraint, I think. They haven't retaliated in kind. And so that's the setup. And so, Joe, wrote some blog posts on this whole ordeal. And what do you think about this issue of heresy and calling them false teachers and heretics? Is this something that is warranted?
Well, when Calvin Smith first wrote those first few posts, I mean, I knew I was going to respond. And the irony is, if anybody knows my stuff, I wrote a book called The Heresy of Ham,
Yes.
partly because I like the alliteration. So yeah, I knew, like, when I was going to comment on it, that I was going to have to, articulate, very, it's, how can I put it? It won't come across well if I say, oh, Calvin, he said this, but then I have a book that, so it's important to kind of, crystallize and clarify those things. But the direct answer to your question is the way he does it, the way Answers in Genesis does it, I don't think it is proper, because I would say, it's petty and mean-spirited. At the same time, like I said in my post, I've been dealing with this stuff for a long enough time where I'm not as worked up on it as I used to be. And now when I see that stuff, it's comical to me. Like, I think I used the example of Steve Martin from The Jerk when he was, damn those glasses. Like, okay, but the problem with the way they do it is they're accusing BioLogos of being the house of heresy based on their stance on certain scientific issues. And so what Answers in Genesis is doing is they're making that as if it is a primary issue of the Christian faith. And so they're calling BioLogos heretical because they believe in millions of years. Well, church, when you look at church history, heresy has a specific meaning. And I think I highlight that in my book, right at the beginning of my book, because I don't want people to misunderstand me. Heresy, the way it really comes down to two things. Either you are teaching something that is directly contradictory to, like, what I call the creedal fundamentals of the Christian faith, like the things that you see in the Nicene Creed, the core teachings that are fundamental to the Christian faith. If you teach something contrary to that, like if you go around saying, hey, Jesus never rose again, you're pretty much a heretic or an unbeliever, right?
Right.
That's one way. But another way, and you see this a lot through church history, is taking a secondary issue or even a non-issue that has nothing to do with the Christian faith and saying it does, and then turn around and start accusing people and dividing people. And, that, and in that sense, what I find Answers in Genesis doing is that's kind of what they're doing, by calling BioLogos heretics on that basis. They're actually showing themselves to be out of the main line of the historic Christian faith. Whether or not you believe in evolution, if you believe in a young earth, I've always said, fine, I think you're wrong, but I don't care. But if you take that issue and make that the fundamental issue of the faith, and you build your whole organization on that and make it a habit of condemning any other Christian who disagrees with you, that's really problematic. And so I think that's when you look at what Calvin Smith did and Answers to Genesis normally does, that's the kind of thing that they do. And that's where the problem is. So.
Yeah. Great. Now, what about this issue where, on the one hand, the title of the blog post is House of Heresy, and they talk about false teaching. But on the other hand, within the post, Calvin seems to bend over backwards at times and say, oh, well, we're not saying they're not Christians. But then he says in other places, well, these are supposed Christians at BioLogos. And it seems like he's trying to talk to his base, his audience on the one hand, and then within the same article, talk to the general public and sort of have it both ways. And it seems not so straightforward. I was bothered by that. How did you react?
Well, again, it's if anybody who's ever spent time reading up on Answers to Genesis stuff and Ken Ham's blog posts, it's par for the course for them. And once you see it, at first it's jarring because it's insulting. Sometimes whether or not you read it, or if in my case you encountered somebody who did that to you, it's very jarring and it's hurtful. But like I said, at the same time, it's par for the course for them. And it's double speak. And I always kind of joke about how, as someone who has been accused of speaking with the voice of the serpent, just because I always make the joke, like, when you see this, I'm not saying, but it's like, wow, you're speaking with a forked tongue, kind of like a serpent. You got to say that in jest because, I can't take them seriously. But that is what they're doing. It is double speak. It's kind of saying, I'm not saying you're a Christian, but I'm kind of saying you're not really a Christian. So how do you respond to that? Again, a sensitive person, the first time you're going to be hurt by it. But then once you see it and you're like, oh, this is what they do, you can't let yourself get hurt by it, because this is what dishonest people do, quite frankly. I hate to be that way, but that's what they do.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the motives of Answers to Genesis putting out this hit piece in a sense. And, I think we do have to give Answers to Genesis a benefit of the doubt, right? Maybe they so strongly believe that the gospel is tied up in their literal interpretation of early Genesis that they really feel they are defending the church. But to an outsider, to someone who's not in that circle, it doesn't really come across that way all the time. In fact, it comes across like, well, what are they trying to do here? Are they maybe threatened by BioLogos in a sense? Are they trying to generate a lot more donations from their core members? What do you, as someone who watches that organization, do you have a guess as to what's going on?
And my first thought was like, to be fair, I don't think they started the fight. I'm not saying BioLogos did, but I'm thinking this whole creation evolution thing, it's been going on for 150 years, ever since the rise of modern science, the rise of modern historical, critical biblical studies. And to a point, starting back in the late 19th century, there have been scholars and scientists, atheists, who try to use evolution to say, oh, the Bible's not true. Christianity isn't true. And there are some Bible scholars who I would say they don't profess to be Christians, but they write books about how the Bible, you can't trust the Bible. So there have been attacks on Christianity in the Bible in the name of modern science and modern biblical studies sometimes. And so I think the people of AIG, and you can go back before them, Henry Morris, the Genesis flood, the more fundamentalist strand, they see that attack, and it is an attack. I mean, it is. But for some reason, they attach all that to this one issue. Like, I have to prove Genesis 1 through 11 is scientific and historical to fight this attack. And what I would like to say is, like, you do need to fight the attack when, but that's not the hill you die on because you're getting it wrong.
Right. So
You know,
it's a shame in a sense they're just making a category error.
yeah, and in that sense, I've often said, to use the poster children, like Ken Ham and Richard Dawkins are really each other's doppelganger in the way they see things. They both think Genesis 1 through 11 is making historical scientific claims. They both start on that assumption. Obviously, Richard Dawkins uses that as, oh, I see, therefore it's all not true. And then Ken Ham says, the only way, sorry, that's my phone. The only way for it to be true, it has to be scientific. But they both come to the text with this idea that it has to be scientific or it's not true. And again, in that sense, they're both making a basic genre category error and basing their whole edifice on that. So
Yeah.
I would say, they didn't start the fight, but their problem is they're misunderstanding what Genesis 1 through 11 is, and they're making it scientific. They're putting all their cards on that. And they seem to be saying that, the church has always believed this when it hasn't. Again, look through church history, church fathers and theologians, they've always had differing opinions on those chapters. And yeah, you could cherry pick people here and there with certain quotes that back up your opinion. But as the fact is, as a historical matter, the church has never made the age of the earth or the historicalness of Adam and Eve a fundamental tenet of the faith. And AIG insists on making that. And because they do, that becomes their sole ideology, no matter what they say. That's really what it is. And they judge everybody based on that alone. And that's why they call BioLogos House of Heresy. And they can't realize that maybe if you're just convinced that the earth is, millions of years old, maybe you're just looking at the scientific evidence and you're okay with that, but for them, it's a doctrinal issue. It's not.
What about BioLogos's policy of platforming people with they're a broad tent. They're a broad tent organization. And, to be fair, evolution poses questions of Christianity that we're trying to work through.
Yeah.
And, from my point of view, I'm okay with platforming people who are putting out ideas that may get closer to the edge than maybe we would normally like, because we're trying to figure things out. Now, I don't know, how does that strike you, and how does that approach fit with your own viewpoint?
Yeah, well, I think that's been the good thing about BioLogos. Back when they started, what was it, 2007, something like that, 2007 or 8. I remember I started reading, contributors and stuff, and I think they do a lot of good by encouraging the discussion about Genesis 1 through 11, evolution, all that stuff. And it needs to be had because most American evangelicals, for that matter, they've grown up kind of assuming that it's historical and scientific. They haven't thought about it much, but that's your kind of assumption. And so now that it's an issue, you need to have a place to discuss. And so I think that's what BioLogos has been able to provide, and that's good. But yes, when you do have that open forum, you're going to get people writing and saying a few things that, upon reflection, might not be the best, And so when you look at the quotes that the article kind of cherry picked, like I said in my post, some of those quotes are a little make me go, huh? Christ's death on the cross isn't part of God's plan. It was. But when you look at the larger context that it was provided by somebody else, I think.
Christian Hemphill, maybe.
Yes. When you saw that, I understood what I think was it Joseph Bankard?
Oh, Joseph Bankard was the quote. That was the
Yes.
quote referring to Christie. Yeah.
When I read the larger context, I understood what he was trying to get at. At the same time, I still don't think he said it in a good way. When you say things that are sometimes careless, or I would say kind of irresponsible in the way it's presented, it can cause people to freak out. And when you're a writer or a teacher or a scholar, you want to, and this is the trick with anything, you want to, prick people to get them to think, kind of challenge them. but you don't want to be needlessly irresponsible in what you say, you know? So for example, in my book, The Heresy of Ham, the very first thing I said was like, let me just be clear on what I mean by heresy. I don't mean this, because a lot of people, you need to be clear and you need to be, you know, cognizant of how you're presenting stuff. Especially with a touchy subject like this. And I do think, even though I like BioLogos and I think they've done a lot of good, and again, I think I said this in my post, you know, if we're to be fair, you know, from time to time, like we all are, sometimes people say things that could have been said better. But that's the process of learning. You got to let a little messiness happen.
Right. And so if you could give some advice to people who contribute to BioLogos as far as watching just sort of crafting what they say. I think you had mentioned in one of your blog posts something about, you know, well, I'll let you run with that. If you could give,
Like the way they present evolution in the Bible. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Well, one of the things I noticed with some of the quotes, I won't name the people because I don't know exactly who said what. Haven't memorized that Calvin Smith's post, but you know, sometimes you hear it's expressed to the effect, you know, evolution shows that Genesis 1 through 11 really isn't historical.
right.
And I'm like, well, and I understand from the writer's perspective, a lot of them grew up assuming it was, right? And so when they learned about, you know, evolutionary theory, what I learned about evolutionary theory doesn't jive with my assumption of Genesis 1 through 11. If you say it that way, evolution shows that our assumptions of Genesis 1 through 11 aren't correct. That's fine. But when you say it shows that Genesis 1 through 11 isn't historical, you're assuming that the original author of Genesis 1 through 11 thought about it the way you do. You know what? That makes sense?
Yes,
And
it
to
does.
use kind of a silly example, because good silly examples always help. It'd be kind of like nobody would ever do this because it's so stupid. Somebody writing a paper, it's like, well, you know, now that we've studied botany, you know, when we look at Robert Burns' poem, My Love is a Red, Red Rose, we now know, contrary to what he thought, that human beings are not flowers. You know, like we already knew that. The problem is you misunderstood the poem as some kind of scientific statement. And so, but again, with all this, particularly in evangelicalism, wrestling with evolution and, you know, other scientific issues concerning origins, it's a new thing. You have to allow some messiness to learn. But at the same time, from time to time, you got to say, well, maybe the problem isn't Genesis 1 through 11. Maybe you've just grown up with the wrong assumptions,
right.
and you're getting them challenged, which is good. But don't think what you have assumed about Genesis 1 through 11 was the correct original meaning. Maybe you're wrong, not Genesis 1 through 11, if that makes sense.
So to wrap up here, what is maybe the most egregious thing that Calvin Smith did in his posts on the website? I mean, there's a lot that we could quibble with, but is there anything that sticks out as being, you know, that just either was just incorrect or just a wrong perspective, or maybe he went somewhere he shouldn't have gone?
Well, I don't think you could point to one thing. I mean, the whole motivation behind both posts. I think, well, he did 2 initial posts, then a few other reaction ones that I haven't read.
I think, and he might be doing a webinar tomorrow. I don't know.
Oh, great. But it just, to me, and again, this is par for the course of a lot of Answers in Genesis stuff. It was just needlessly hostile. And again, when you look at church history from time to time, when there really is false teaching, you do have to address it. But you have to make sure your teaching is correct as well. And the very motivation of calling BioLogos and anybody who associates with BioLogos heretics simply because they're convinced of modern science on some issues that the Bible doesn't touch, it comes across as needlessly hostile, but it's also predictable. When you cling to an ideology of any kind, and I would say almost make it your idol, you need to defend it, and you need to lash out on anybody who challenges your ideological idol. And I think I've come to realize that for most, maybe not most, a lot of young earth creationists, specific like Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, Calvin Smith, it's not, they have made that young earth creationist doctrine that's their theological linchpin, and they hang everything on it, and they've made it into their own theological idol. And when you do that, when you try to hold on to something that you're not too, I mean, you're sure of, but it's iffy, you lash out at people and anybody who threatens you. Whereas if you're, I would say, truly secure in your faith, and people attack your view, you don't freak out. You freak out when there's something wrong, but you can't admit it. So you have to lash out, if that makes sense. And I think that's what I see. That's what I've always seen with, a lot of people at Young Earth, Answers in Genesis. And so it's one of those things. So